Hey guys, what's up? This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to speak to you guys about Ninian Smart and the 7 dimensions of religion. Now, some of you guys may already be familiar with the 7 dimensions of religion. If you had taken a theories course on religion or an introductory course in religious studies or comparative world religions course, then usually, if the professor was worth their salt, would have introduced Ninian Smart and his 7 dimensions of religion in the first or second day and discussed how they are really useful methodological or sort of rubric in terms of comparing religious systems to each other. So this is what I want to talk to you guys about today briefly. This shouldn't be a very long video, but these dimensions are really useful when even critically analyzing ideologies or systems of thought that aren't explicitly religious, like climate change or social justice or something like this. You can take these 7 dimensions, which are the ritual dimension, the experiential emotional dimension, the narrative mythic dimension, the doctrinal philosophical dimension, the ethical legal dimension, social and institutional, and the material dimension of religion. And you can use these 7 characteristics or 7 dimensions to analyze worldviews, ideologies, systems of thought to each other. And so that's what we're going to discuss in this video. I want to go through each dimension and briefly highlight just my own thoughts about it. But first, before I do that, I want to introduce who Ninian Smart is. Some of you guys may not be familiar, and Ninian Smart is a prominent Scottish professor of religion. He's dead now. He lived from May 1927 to January 2001. And he, like I mentioned, is a Scottish professor, most noted for founding the first religious studies department in the UK. He did that over at the University of Lancaster. And so he was a very important figure in regards to distinguishing religious studies as a secular academic field compared to theology. And the way he did that was discuss how religious studies was not interested in epistemological claims, truth claims, or apologetics, whereas religious studies is more interested in just the analyzing the worth and comparisons, commonalities between worldviews and religious systems. So that's what he did, and he actually taught in the United States. He accepted a tenured position over at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who still to this day is noted for one of the top religious studies programs in the country. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is how he discussed religious studies as like the secular, tradition of studying religion that is not interested in truth claims and apologetics, and how myself, having did an undergraduate degree in religious studies, master's, and now doing a doctoral, that the whole progress has actually brought me to the point back to Christianity, where what we do on this video, or what I do on this channel, and we talk about, are usually epistemological claims and apologetics. So it's just funny how the whole process I've kind of done the exact opposite. But I digress from there. Let's get into these 7 dimensions. And so the first dimension is ritual. And this basically is interested in what do adherents do. And some of the things that came to mind in regards to systems that could be analyzed through the ritual dimension would be like prayer, how prayer is done within the Christian tradition. But another dimension would be something like puja. This is the Sanskrit term in Hinduism for a sort of ritual offering to various devas, gods, statues, whatever you want to call it. And that's actually the puja you could see as a common dimension, this sort of ritual offering, even within Taoism, Confucianism, ancestral worship in China, something like this. Also, what else would be included within the sort of ritual dimensions? Well, something like pilgrimage and the Hajj within Islam, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, where you need to go to Mecca, one time in your life if you're physically able and financially capable. This is a sort of ritual dimension, the pilgrimage aspect. The way people dress, it can also be included within the ritual dimension of religion, why they wear the certain colors they wear, what do they wear. So immediately I start to think of Catholic priest, a Muslim imam, Buddhist monk, something like this. You can analyze their dress as a sort of ritual in and of itself, as well as festivals and the annual cycles. So this is a sort of critique pagan or secular or atheist people try to make at Christianity, associating with solar religion, given the commonalities of Christmas being, on the winter solstice and Easter on the spring equinox, and these type of symbols and iconography related to solar religion, that the festival or the annual cycle or the liturgical calendar or the festival calendar, these are aspects of ritual. And this is going to highlight these other dimensions as well. But one could also be looking at sacrifice and the lack of sacrifice. So sacrifice is common within other religious traditions. Sacrifice is a fixture within paganism. However, within Christianity, Christ says in Mark 9:13 that he asked for mercy and not sacrifice. So it's interesting how you can use these things, and then they're really useful in terms of comparing religious systems to each other. Sorry. The second dimension is the experiential and emotional dimension. What do people feel? So this is very subjective, certainly, in regards to religion and analyzing it, but it also connects to sort of definitions of religion, somebody like William James. So another video I'd like to do next week is a sort of definitions of religion and how various scholars within religion like Freud or Durkheim or William James or Clifford Geertz, how they approach their definition of religion and what religion is. So for William James, if you guys are familiar with his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, kind of one of his more important works, or the most important work from him, he gives a phenomenological definition of religion, and that religion is basically, he would say, is based in the feelings, acts, and experiences of an individual men in their solitude so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they deem to consider the divine. Now, he came up with this definition after he did a sort of nitrous oxide episode where he ingested this and then had a sort of mystical revelation, a mystical experience, and then he redefined religion based on essentially phenomenology. So you can see the experiential emotional dimension. This is important in regards to Muhammad or the conversion of Paul or Buddha claiming enlightenment. This is sort of the phenomenological core of religion, right? The experiential, the emotional, they kind of all revolve around that from the individual perspective. Now, if you're taking a sociological perspective of your religion, you wouldn't start with the emotional or the experiential. However, typically, if you are approaching it from individualistically or phenomenologically, this is the core of religion. And so actions like repentance, which is a ritual, right? Because all these dimensions are going to connect with each other, but it certainly has an emotional, experiential dimension to repentance, or even feelings of awe, right? This is something that religions do, is they induce these sort of transcendental mind states that are in awe or a reverential state of something transcendent like God. Now, this is going to lead to our third dimension. This is the narrative and mythic dimension. And I think this is a really important one in regards to, say you're going to analyze global climate change as a new religious movement, you can then look at what texts are sacred and what kind of literature is promoted, what type of myths are promoted, the mythic narrative. And this would certainly connect with something like Gaia or James Lovelock's Gaian hypothesis, this idea that the earth is a conscious entity just as we are, but at a larger scale. Certainly that myth is undergirding a lot of people's kind of thoughts about the climate, Mother Nature, all this stuff. So what stories are told and what do they convey? This is really what the dimension of narrative and myth is about. So then you can start to look at religious traditions and look at oral versus written traditions, oral versus written myths and narratives. You can look at creation narratives. You can look at destruction narratives. You can look at redemption narratives. You can look at soteriological narratives, narratives about salvation. You can look at, one of the things that I wanted to say in regards to the myth is that to me, the myth and the ritual are really closely associated, because most of the time, if you really think about it, the ritual is a sort of enacting out of a myth to some degree. And one thing that we would be familiar with is something like the Eucharist or communion. And I'm not trying to say that the Last Supper is a fictional story of myth, but any retelling of something that happened, whether it's literally or symbolic, is a myth. So if I start to tell you a story about, my day yesterday and all the things that happened, that is a sort of myth or a narrative that I'm spinning. Doesn't mean it's not true. And my point is that the myth of the Last Supper and the Eucharist, or the narrative of the Last Supper and the Eucharist, is certainly reenacted by the Eucharist and communion. So right there you can see how these dimensions, they kind of fuse with each other, and that's why I think they're so useful, is because it kind of analytically separates these things so you can better conceptualize them. So ritual, myth, highly associated with each other, and often the ritual is the enaction of the myth. So this leads to the fourth dimension of religion, and this is the doctrinal or philosophical dimension. So the systematic conception of the world, the doctrinal and philosophical. I would say most of this channel kind of analyzes the world from this dimension, because it's from the doctrinal and the philosophical where you really get at the presuppositions of the worldview. And to me, the way that we talk about it on this channel is the presuppositions are what shape somebody's paradigm and worldview, and therefore their worldview is going to color and influence their experience and reading of the world. So one of the things that are interesting that usually a professor will ask undergraduate students in regards to these dimensions is which one's most important and which one came first. It's kind of a chicken and the egg type question, because as I pointed out with the ritual and the myth, which one comes first, the myth or the ritual? And or the experiential and the emotional. And for here, it's the doctrinal and the philosophical. Now, even though I think the presuppositional analysis is so crucial because it really undergirds the window in which somebody's looking onto the world from, I don't think necessarily this is the first of these characteristics, although I don't think there is a first of the characteristics. This is usually just a thought experiment professors will ask undergraduates is, which of the 7 characteristics was first? Which one's most important? And it kind of highlights this interconnectivity and this inability to really say which one was first. But the doctrinal and the philosophical is where you're getting your systematic theology. You're really articulating your presuppositions of the world, your understanding of sacred text and maybe hermeneutics and what things mean symbolically, archetypally. Semiotics are going to certainly be discussed within this dimension, the doctrinal and the philosophical. And then you have things in terms of the doctrine of something like the Christian. Before I get there, the development of thought and intellectual history. So this is where you can even look at like the ecumenical councils within Christianity, sort of development of doctrine and development of the philosophical theological system, the systematic worldview. And so even though I think maybe this is the more important in terms of this would be my argument that the doctrinal and the philosophical is probably the most important of the 7 characteristics or 7 dimensions of religion, because it is where the presuppositions lie and are most articulated. And it's the presuppositions that, as somebody who is an apologist or trying to argue for the Christian worldview, you would attack the presuppositions of an atheist or a paganist or a perennialist or whoever they are, a Muslim. You would attack their presuppositions of the worldview to show how that is inconsistent. So in terms of a comparison of worldviews or systems, I think that one's the most important, although obviously religious studies isn't doing apologetics like we do on this channel. So, yeah, that's that. Now moving on to the fifth dimension, we have the ethical and the legal dimension. And so what is good and bad? This is kind of what's going to be expressed within this dimension of religion. What is good and bad? How should one live their life? So obviously within the legal aspect of this, you're going to, immediate things that immediately come to mind for me is Sharia law, right? And how Sharia law, it highlights then the ritual, the mythical, the experiential, the doctrinal, philosophical, that the Sharia law, the law of Torah, the Noahide laws within Judaism, these sets of laws and ethics are entirely colored by the larger philosophical religious system, which then is developed through ritual and myth and experience and all these things. So certainly an ethical doctrine of something like the Christian ethic of love is going to differentiate it from other religious systems in the world. The ethical and legal is certainly really interesting in regards to like a Christian talking about female genital mutilation. This is going to be a point of difference. And so I think the ethical is really interesting to look at, even something like human sacrifice, abortion. These are all colored by, again, your presuppositions of the world, which is going to fall back into the fourth dimension, the doctrinal and philosophical. But you can see, again, how all these are kind of embedded within each other like a sort of Russian doll. Now, the sixth dimension, the social and institutional, how are people's interactions organized? This is really what this dimension is interested in. So we're looking at things like actual meeting places such as church, mosque, and temples, monastic orders, monasticism itself. How are people's interactions organized? What is it that you have to do? What are the social or cultural customs or the religious customs? I think here you can start looking at larger institutional levels. You can start analyzing papacy or the Ummah. This would be compared. The Ummah is the term used in Islam to refer to the entire global Muslim body. Similarly, in Christianity, we call it Christendom. Usually is referred to the entire Christian body in the world. And through the social and institutional dimension, I think is really interesting because for me, the way that I approach a lot of my scholarship or apologetics or this channel is through the presuppositional, doctrinal, philosophical, but then the social, analytical, institutional level. And so in this dimension, you can compare totems. So totems or totism is developed by the sociologist Emil Durkheim in The Elements of Religion or something like this. But, well, in fact, I have the book. Yeah. The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, Emil Durkheim. He's kind of the French founder of sociology, and he's got a very sociological definition of religion, and for him it's all about totems, and that the totem is basically the central symbol, like a totem pole. This is where he's getting it, is analyzing tribal societies and how they circumambulate some type of totem, some totem pole, some symbol, some myth, some deity, some ritual, and that religion then kind of moves out and develops from some type of totem. This is his definition of religion. Certainly, totemism can be analyzed from the sociological institutional dimension of religion, as well as larger sociological analysis of culture. So one of the videos that I also want to make in relation to definitions of religion is talking about Peter Berger's theory of a sacred canopy. I mentioned this in my video on sociology and Christianity, but I think it's really useful to learn about Peter Berger's theory of the sacred canopy and how every culture, every community has a canopy of values. And so your myths, your symbols, your ethics, basically all these dimensions of religion are kind of embedded within this larger sacred canopy, as he would argue, from the sociological dimension. And through this process of legitimation, which I'll explain in that video, you produce these symbols, and it's like this feedback loop that you construct a sacred canopy. And therefore, everybody has the same presuppositions, the same understandings of language and words and symbols and what they mean. And so, right now in the culture war in America, you can see the splitting of the sacred canopy and how really progressivism, liberal tradition, really, since the Enlightenment has been moving to this point, but how it's really ruptured and created a new sacred canopy. So the symbols, the ideas, the values that they kind of idolize are different from the values of more traditional Christian American culture, something like that. So they have a totally different sacred canopy. So from the social institutional dimensions, you can take a look at this, and then you can start to compare the sacred canopies of all the different world religions. What is the different values and myths and symbols from Islam to Hinduism, or from Taoism to Christianity, or something like this? But this is the sixth dimension of religion, and to me, I think it's really useful when thinking about religion on a larger scale. And for me, combine that with the doctrinal, the philosophical, the presuppositions of the world. So the presuppositions really highlight the individual and what they're seeing, and then the sacred canopy really highlights the culture at large, which is going to be reflective of those presuppositions. So this leads to the last dimension of religion, and this is the material dimension of religion. I think this is really one of the more interesting dimensions to compare religions on. So from here, we're looking at physical, embodied aspects of religion, physical forms of religion. So, for example, architecture. We can look at the difference between Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, Catholic architecture versus Protestant architecture, and how that's reflected then in their theology about the ornateness, about the simplicity of God, and all these things, about sola scriptura. Protestantism is this kind of simplification of the tradition to sola scriptura, sola fide, all this stuff. So you can see that reflected in the architecture. You can look at how homes are built. So within the kind of African or the native systems here within, you can look at pueblos, you can look at all these different people and how do they build their houses. Some of the more tribal people will actually structure their houses in correspondence with constellations in the sky, the materials they use to build their homes. Even within European-based society, the way that they build homes, the way that they think about living, all is kind of shaped or influenced by their religious worldview. So we also, within the material dimensions, you can look at divine representations. You can compare something like Islam, which has no divine representations of Allah outside sacred geometry, really, to Orthodox Christianity, which has explicit icons depicting biblical individuals, narratives, Christ, saints, and even how that's not approved of by something like Protestantism. So it's even within the same religious tradition, you can see how the material dimension of religion is very different between Protestants and Orthodox or something like that. You can also look at masks, clothing, scripture, how are books understood. So certainly within the, how would you say it? Well, you could analyze Buddhism, for example. Buddhism is the religious system with the most sacred texts out of any world religion, and you could start to analyze their relationship to text versus shamanism, versus paganism, versus anything really. So that's a very useful dimension to compare things. The material dimension can also analyze natural objects, natural features, mountains, rivers, landmarks. So you can start to analyze through the material dimension things like the Ganges River, a sacred river that's created by, that's the footstep of Shiva on the planet. You can look at sacred mountains. You can look at, how people relate to nature. You can look at sacred landmarks where myths or rituals or all these things are said to have happened. So then you can see how these dimensions are continually feeding back into each other. And of course, sacred cities are sacred sites. So for Catholics, obviously, something like Rome would be a sacred city. Same thing in Islam with the Mecca. So the material dimension is a useful dimension in terms of analyzing religion. So this kind of wraps up what it is I want to discuss in this video. I just wanted to highlight these 7 dimensions and why they're useful and how they're useful in comparing religion and also in comparing worldviews, because even Ninian Smart, who developed these 7 dimensions, highlighted how he believed ideologies, and this is why he developed his 7 dimensions, to take on multiple characteristics of religion. And for him, he highlighted Marxism and how Marxism is like a sort of religion, and then you can use these dimensions to kind of articulate that and demonstrate that. So that's it. Ritual, experiential, emotional, narrative, mythic, doctrinal, philosophical, ethical and legal, social, institutional, and material dimension. These are the 7 dimensions according to Ninian Smart, and that is propagated within the field of religious studies on how you analyze religions and compare religions to each other. The 7 dimensions of religion. So that's it. That's all I wanted to share with you guys. Let me know what you guys think. Do you agree, disagree? Do you think these are useful dimensions? Do you think there's aspects of religion that exist outside these 7 dimensions or can't be kind of contained within these 7 dimensions of religion? What do you guys think? Are you familiar? Are you not familiar with these? Let me know in the comment section. As always, I love you guys. Thank you so much for the support. Please like, share, and subscribe to the video. Please share the video if you have the opportunity. If you feel so willing, please share the video. That's obviously the most helpful in the long run. But thank you guys for everything. I really appreciate it. And until next time. Oh, also, what I wanted to mention is that next week, with the videos you can... So I'm currently doing research for our video that will be posted or on Sunday, which will be the Logos. It'll be part of the Logos series and the Logos in the Old Testament. So the Old Testament and the Logos. We'll be talking about that on Sunday. That should be posted then. I also wanted to talk, as I mentioned, I'm either going to make the Sacred Canopy of Peter Berger, that video for next week, or the various definitions of religion. And both of those are eventually going to be made, but those might be next week. And I also want to spend time to really make a video on hypocrisy and talking about biblical understandings and why being a hypocrite is such a terrible sin, and then highlighting things that we're seeing in the world that is just immense hypocrisy, something like the NBA and China and their promotion of social justice and free speech while acquiescing to the communist demands from China, politics, all these things. I wanted to make a video really highlighting culture and hypocrisy and then talking about the Bible. What does the Bible say about hypocrisy? So these 3 to 4 videos you can expect in the near future. That's kind of what I'm working on, so I just wanted to let you guys know about that. But anyways, with that being said, this is the end of the video. Please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, as always, God bless.